This is Beyond Average, Episode 8.
The one thing we have in this world is we can't control the events, but we can choose what to focus on, we can choose what things mean, and we can choose what to do.
We're live.
Hey, good morning, good evening, good night. Again, whatever time you're listening to us, thanks for tuning in. You're listening to Beyond Average, the podcast bringing you a new way of thinking about health, wealth, and entrepreneurship. My name is Corey Anderson.
I am Anthony Palmiato, and we are on Episode 8.
Episode 8. And we're discussing a very interesting topic, a very not well known or heard of topic.
But we're talking today about something that is probably the single most important thing to know about economics, something that affects literally everybody on planet Earth, especially Americans. And it's sad, actually, how few people know anything about the Federal Reserve Bank. So we're gonna shed some light on it.
Yeah, and I was going to say that, throughout history, there's been a battle of central banks always trying to control currency supplies, and really, it's like you just said, it's so important to understand what exactly it is, and it's funny the name of it is Federal Reserve, but
it's no more federal than Federal Express.
Exactly. And the second part's reserve, yet they have no reserves. No one actually saw that there's no gold in there, but anytime anybody tries to ask, they say no. So you can only speculate.
Yeah, it's an absolute joke. But before we jump in, we'll just say check out this episode, beyondaveragepodcast.com/008. We'll have the show notes, and probably this episode more than any, it's important to go check that out because we're going to have a lot of resources that are really important to understanding, kind of what's going on here. So check that out. And then the Facebook page is facebook.com/beyondaveragepodcast. And subscribe to the show on iTunes, Stitcher, and show us some love, man. Leave us a review on iTunes. That would help us out big time.
Yeah, and hopefully we're still here after the show. Hopefully don't go nowhere.
Yeah, well, we had a little bit of a hiatus since last episode, but it's a good thing because the reason we haven't put an episode out is because we're busy as hell.
Yeah, it's a good problem to have, right? As long as you don't have the same old problems, that's a good thing. New problems are good problems.
And big problems are good problems.
Exactly. So bring the problems on. You're going to have problems. You might as well have good problems.
Yeah. Right? I want big, massive problems that need major solutions.
All right. I want money problems, but the other kind of money problems.
Too much money. What are you going to do with it? Because you can't let it sit in the bank because of the Federal Reserve. They stealing all your wealth.
Oh man, what a plug right there, and that's absolutely true.
That's a good segue to jump right in. So
exactly.
Well, first of all, let's just talk about what is the Fed? I mean, people know the term Federal Reserve, but nobody really understands like what it is in relation to the government.
And I don't know if you agree, but the only thing I think that government should have control of is money and it being issued. And that was the case for, a very long time. And what the Federal Reserve is a central bank. So it's like an extension of the government, but it's not the government. It's a private-owned bank. And that's never a good thing when a private company can control a nation's money supply. And that's exactly what it is, right?
Well, it should be up to the free market, in my opinion. So it should be voluntary exchange. Should dictate how monetary policy works, not a government created entity that doesn't even answer to the government anymore. They really do their own thing. They one of the big things you might have heard in the news lately is audit the Fed. That was something Ron Paul was heading for a long time, to just say basically, hey, look, open up the books. Let's just see what the hell the Fed is doing. We have no idea what's even going on there, and just even looking at their books would reveal so much information that would probably make a lot of Americans wake up and say, hey, we need to get rid of this evil organization and you probably agree that this is the most powerful organization in the world, and they don't fight wars with bombs and bullets like governments do. but they literally
Right.
control our money supply.
They make Yeah, and they make money off of what you just mentioned, indirectly. But the crazy thing is, they're literally the only organization, entity, company, whatever you want to call them, in the world that doesn't have to answer to the government. And when the governments are literally, afraid of these guys because of the power they have. And Scarface said it best: first you get the money, then you get the power, then you get the women. Right? So I mean, if you got the money, you got the power. Like, and it's so true.
And I used to say when Ben Bernanke was the Fed chair, he was the most powerful man in the world, and now Janet Yellen is the Fed chair, and she's the most powerful woman in the world. And I think that's absolutely
Right.
true. So, but let's start the story at the beginning. Um, the Fed is not the first central bank we've ever had in this country. Hopefully, it'll be the last. But there was actually two that came before it. So the first one was proposed by Alexander Hamilton, eventually got passed. Didn't have its charter renewed in the early 1800s. Um, and then there was the second Federal Reserve Bank, which met its end when Andrew Jackson ended that bank.
Right. And to get back a little further, to mention, I mean, the Revolutionary War. I mean, why we're all here today. A big reason that war was fought was because of the control that banks had over America. But at that time, it was Britain banks. And the problem with the central banks, like, let's take, for example, we have a $20 note that's backed by gold. There's no interest attached to that. But central banks charge interest. And that was a big thing, that why we want to break away from Britain. And, Revolutionary War happened. The rest is history. And then those evil entities kind of followed us over. And then kind of what you just mentioned, there was a couple attempts at central banks, and they got back down by our forefathers.
Yeah, and it's messed up because the current bank, the Federal Reserve Bank, has a really interesting way in which it was, put into an existence. Which is basically, there's a really good book that we'll link to called "The Creature from Jekyll Island," which was basically something that happened in 1910, where a bunch of the elitists in the country, some politicians, and other bigwigs met on
On
this.
the Morgan estate in
Yeah,
Georgia.
little tiny island off the coast of Georgia, and discussed basically what would end up being the creation of the Fed, and it got put into law a few years later. Interestingly enough, it got voted on. I think it was the break between
Christmas.
Christmas and New Year's, right? So most of Congress wasn't even there, and it got the votes it needed while everybody was away with their families, and that's how it came into existence.
Right. And Woodrow Wilson, the president at the time that signed it in, actually said it was his biggest mistake he ever made. But at that time, it was too late.
And interestingly enough, it was also the same year that we put into law the income tax.
Right. And I mean, if you can correct me, give me a simpler way of putting it. When I mentioned interest before, when we pay our income tax, that's just going towards the interest on our dollars. If that makes any sense to anybody,
Well, money is just debt.
it's just debt.
It's actually created from nothing, and we have to pay it
Right.
back with interest to the Fed. And think about this: if there was no money in existence and the Fed creates $100 and we owe them interest, there's only $100. So
Exactly.
you can't even pay back the interest.
So you're automatically, as soon as that first dollar is printed,
Enslaved.
you're enslaved, and you're set to default. It's really no, because that other dollar doesn't exist. When you're tied to gold and you have sound money, you don't owe it back. It's tied to a legitimate, tangible asset, and it's real. The paper itself, it doesn't have any intrinsic value, but it's tied to something that does. And the problem with the Federal Reserve is, like I said, they lend this money to America, and they charge us a fee for it, and we pay for it.
So basically, we'll kind of go over the boom bust cycle that the free market economists describe, and basically the reason it happens is because of the Fed. So the Fed has what they call, it's a dual mandate. They're supposed to be doing two things. One is to maintain stable prices, and two is to maximize employment. And those are basically two goals that they try to achieve by manipulating the currency supply. So the way the Fed manipulates the markets to achieve their goals of stable prices and maximum employment is, for the most part, through manipulating interest rates. And
Right.
they're not directly changing the interest rates at which you and I pay credit card debt or borrow money for a house or a car. It's at a much higher level than that. The money at which banks lend to each other, and is as it goes through the system, all interest rates are affected. And
Right.
the problem with that is huge, because that means if they're changing it other than what it is, it's not supposed to be that way. The markets didn't want interest rates to be higher or lower, otherwise they would have been.
Exactly.
And basically, in the economy, entrepreneurs respond to interest rates and they act a certain way. And so you're sending mixed signals to entrepreneurs who are going to take different courses of action because the Fed is trying to influence policy one way or the other.
Exactly. Yeah. Yep. And like you said, that the market would like if interest rates went up naturally, it's because there's a high demand for capital, and a lot of businesses are trying to get started, and there's not enough money to start these businesses, so interest rates will go up. It's just all basic economics, supply and demand.
So
When they mess with that, though, they throw the whole system off.
yeah,
And
so let's read. We have a couple paragraphs here that kind of simplifies and outlines they call it the business cycle theory from free market economics, and then we'll just kind of comment on it. But so the first point is that interest rates in a free market are determined by the time preference of investors and creditors, which is the holders, owners, and savers of capital. In other words, when the investors want to keep their money and consume it themselves at the present time, interest rates go up. If the investors want to invest and set aside their money for future gain, the rate of interest is naturally lowered. It's a supply and demand issue. The rate of interest indicates how much a society or market is willing and able to loan to borrowers. So that may or may not make sense, but basically it's very intuitive. When people are saving and they're not consuming right now, there's going to be lots of savings in the banks, which means that there's a lot of money to be lent out. That means things are good, and interest rates will naturally be lower because there's a lot of money to lend. Right? Makes sense.
there's a lot of supply, so it's going to affect, like you said, the interest rates
Right. So
naturally.
supply is high, so the price of money, which is interest, is low. And what that means is it's sending signals to entrepreneurs that things are good, and now is a good time to take on longer-term, riskier projects. So if you want to build, $1 million houses on the beach, if you're a real estate developer, this might be a time when you're going to do it because the money's cheaper and things are good. So you're going to invest in a project like that when you otherwise wouldn't, right?
Right.
Makes perfect sense. Now
Exactly.
the problem is when the Fed artificially lowers rates, just like we're doing right now, they're still sending a signal to developers and borrowers saying, borrow money, things are great, build stuff, invest in long-term projects, except things are not good. It's kind of a facade,
Exactly.
and millions of people are going to be left holding the bag.
Right, and that's why in China, actually, you can look into it. It's really interesting. You can just do a quick YouTube search. They're called like ghost cities, and they're just cities that are built because of the same thing. It's just a bubble. Like the money gets pumped into the system with low rates, and like you said, the construction, they see it as a signal to build and build and build, but is a facade. It wasn't real, and it's like a mirage. You're in the desert. You get to the water and you dip your hand in it and you get a bunch of sand, and that's exactly what it is.
So I'll read point 2, which kind of just talks about the explanation that we just gave, which says, if the central bank artificially lowers the interest rate lower than the rate at which the market is ready to loan, businesses misread the signals and start long-term projects that the market cannot handle because it does not have the savings prepared for all of the production. And I'll just stop right there and basically say that's like trying to build a house that needs 1,000 bricks. And as far as you know, there's plenty of bricks to build a house. So you start building, and once you get 500 bricks in, you realize that there's not actually 1,000 bricks, there's only 750. Meanwhile, you're already 500 bricks into this project. And that's kind of a metaphor for what's going on in the economy. People start projects that they think are going to make a lot of sense, but there's not actually enough capital saved in the banks for them to make those projects come to fruition. And then
Right.
millions of people get left holding the bag.
Yeah, exactly. And you want to think about it like to make it visual for you. You know, the money supply is referred to as capital, right? And it's called a misallocation of capital. And it sounds like a big word, but it's really nothing. It's just the money finds its way into industries it doesn't belong, and they create bubbles. So it's like water being forced into a bunch of balloons, and you have all these blown up balloons, and that's kind of what happens. So like you said, that's where the housing bubble came from, is what you're saying. The money doesn't belong there. It's not supposed to
Right.
be in the industry, but it kind of just gets pumped in because that's what the signals are being sent. You know.
And that's exactly what happened, with the stock market bubble of the 2000 and 2001.
Right.
And instead of pricking that bubble and letting things get back to normal, we kind of rolled it right into the housing bubble. But
Right.
let's continue on point two here. So it's important to note that the growth occurs mainly in the capital goods industries rather than the consumer goods industries. The reason for this is because the capital goods production is the furthest removed from the time the beginning is the furthest removed in time from beginning the finished consumer goods, and they are therefore require years of production and lower interest rates. During the time of growth, the economy seems great, wages are increased, jobs created, and production expands. But since the economy cannot handle the new growth, the required resources were not saved, and time preferences were not really lowered. So that's exactly what we're saying. People are taking on longer term, riskier projects because interest rates are so low. The signals being sent to entrepreneurs saying times are good. There's plenty of money saved up for you to borrow and put to work to invest in a new project, but it's just not. It's artificial.
Right.
And that's basically what's been happening over and over and over again. The government and the Fed think that they can use interest rates to kind of have their way with the economy and make it do what they please, but all they do is create booms and busts.
Exactly. And that's why right now we're in a car loan bubble. We're in a student loan bubble. We're in another housing bubble. It's just we're bubbling out the ass. It's just there's bubbles all over the place, and it's the low interest rates, the cheap money, and the money just keeps getting pumped in at low rates, and it's not looking good, guys. Not very good.
So let's finish this with the third point on the boom bust cycle. So it says when rates are artificially low and people start taking on projects that they can't, two things happen. And it says, first, all the wages that are paid out are not spent on the newly created capital because the time preference of the individuals is not focused on saving in capital, but rather on consumption. Reason being is because they think that things are really good and it's okay to consume because they feel good about themselves and the economy. It says the workers who have received these wages direct their consumption to the consumer goods industries and don't save and invest enough to buy the newly produced machines, capital equipment, industrial raw material, etc. Therefore, much of the capital that was invested in was a waste, or in other terms, malinvestment. The second thing that happens is because the low interest rates make the economic actors act as if there were more savings, the demand throughout the economy is higher than the supply. And so projects run out of money, buildings are left unfinished, and so on and so forth. This is called the bust, and this is what happens when the bubble bursts. As can be seen in the Austrian theory, or free market economics, it's the expansion of credit and the lowering of interest rates, which are the actions of the central bank that causes depressions and recessions in an economy. So basically, the 10-second version of it is, the Fed artificially lowers interest rates, mixed signals are sent, projects are taken on that shouldn't be, and then we end up having a boom and then the ultimate bust.
Right.
And what's even worse than the boom and the bust is the fact that we don't let the bust happen. It's like taking your bad medicine. The medicine doesn't taste good, but ultimately it's better for you in the long term.
Well, one thing we were talking about before the show was in 1920 they did let the bust happen, and things went back to normal within the year. And it was really the only time that the Fed did the right thing was by staying out of it.
And the reason
it was actually after the Fed was created, because they were created in 1913.
Yeah, and the reason we mention that is because in 1920, we had the start of a recession, or I don't know if it was classified as a depression. I'm sure it was.
The depression, I believe, yeah.
There was a quarter of that year that was actually worse than the first quarter of the Great Depression.
Right.
But coincidentally, Woodrow Wilson, who was president at the time, had suffered a stroke not long before that and was kind of, on his way out of the office and didn't do anything. Basically kind of just let the economy ride it out. And the economy fixed itself within months and got on the right track because there was no government interference.
Yep. And then we had and then you had the Roaring Twenties. But the funny thing about the Roaring Twenties was that's when monetary policy changed. They lowered rates and they started pumping money into the economy. And I believe it was because I think Britain was going through money problems, and by us increasing our money supply, it helped them. And you had the Roaring Twenties, and then the big followed by the big bust of 1929, and we all know what that was.
The crazy thing about it is you will read articles where they say that the government got us out of the Great Depression. It was years and years and years and years.
Right.
They're the reason we were in the Depression and the reason that it was so long and so terrible. What the government was doing was paying you to paint a fence, and then they would pay me to come by and just paint the same fence over again, like not adding any value to the economy, just trying to put people to work so they have money in their pockets, which just shows they don't understand anything about economics.
Well, and the worst part about that is people will actually argue for the government, and I guess it makes sense in their head that, well, the government was creating jobs. Yeah, but they weren't productive jobs, and that's where the basis of economy is in production and savings. And right now we're based off consumption and debt, the exact opposite.
Yeah.
And that's what government spending, government jobs is debt. It's just they try to argue that point, and I guess again it makes sense in their head, but it's not productive jobs. Like you said, the money has to come from somewhere. Where do they think it comes from?
So as a more recent example, Alan Greenspan in the 90s had slashed interest rates, not quite to zero, but super low, which caused the NASDAQ bubble, where stocks with no earnings had ridiculously high valuations, and it was just absolutely no reason for it. And it was unsustainable, obviously, and that eventually came to a head. That bubble burst.
And that was the NASDAQ bubble.
That was the NASDAQ bubble.
Cut out for a second, but I got you.
Yeah, the NASDAQ bubble. And instead of doing the right thing and letting the markets clear, letting stock prices come back to reasonable levels, we rolled it right into a new bubble. And they weren't trying to inflate a bubble, but that's what they did because they cut interest rates to zero. And the money this time, instead of going into the stock market, found itself in the real estate market.
Right.
And people were just buying houses with the intention of selling it 6 months later for an extra $10,000 or $15,000, as if that was how real estate worked. So people thought that real estate only went one direction. They thought that if you buy a house, it appreciates in value forever, as if that's how things worked. What logical reason would there be for a house to just go up in value forever? It doesn't make any sense.
Right.
But because the money was so cheap, the banks were lending to literally anyone, and there was other government policies that influenced that. But that's what kind of gave a rise to the housing prices. And ultimately that bubble burst. We had the Great Recession of 2008, and we're doing it all over again. Rates are at zero, and we're trying to reinflate bubbles because they're scared at this point to let the markets clear, and they don't want to take their medicine.
It's the only card left in the deck. That's all I have to play is just to keep doing it over and over, because once I read a book called Why Nations Fail, or I forget the name off the top of my head right now, but it talked about gorges. Like you hop down gorges, and what a gorge is like a waterfall. And once you go down a certain level, you really can't go back up. And they applied it to how money works. Basically, once you start printing and once you start doing certain things, it's just kind of impossible to go back the other way. And that's kind of where we're at now. There's no other options but to just keep it going. The other option is to let everything default, and we're going to have a real recession, and we're going to need a real recovery, and it's going to hurt. It's going to hurt bad, but that's the only way that's going to get better.
Yeah, I mean, it's like Peter Schiff always uses the drug addict example. If you're addicted to heroin, it fucking sucks when you go through withdrawal. I say that like I know from experience, but so apparently it sucks to get off of heroin, and the withdrawal symptoms are absolutely terrible, but that means you're actually getting off of it. You know what I mean? That's the recovery.
Right.
And we are addicted to money right now. and
Right.
you have to get off of it, and there's some pain before it gets better. But that's just the way it goes.
Another analogy used is pretty, comical, I guess, is what these guys are doing. You don't put out a fire with gasoline, and that's what they're doing. They're trying to put a fire out with gasoline, and it's burning brighter. And like I said, it's a shitty situation because they're just going to keep inflating and printing away until right now we're in something called a government bubble where we're just insolvent and we're broke, and that's the
Probably
worst kind of
government,
bubble to be
yeah,
in because there's really nothing after that.
and probably student loans or government bonds are going to be the next bubble to burst. And I think the next one that bursts is the real depression, that we're going to sink way worse than 2008 into the abyss, and that's when the shit's really going to hit the fan.
Right. And the funny thing is, like, if you're ever on the internet or people say, you can hear them say sometimes, like, oh, what they've been saying there's going to be a huge crash for 15 years, and yeah, it's the thing about markets, and there's so many factors that play into it. I can tell you by next year, 2015, end of the year, a burst is going to happen, but the the expertiest expert still can't predict that because you can't take into account consumer confidence, the confidence of the people in their dollar, the way we feel about markets. I mean, a lot of emotions get played into it too. So, and because America's such a big country, people probably still think it's indestructible, where it can't fail.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you really can't put a time frame on it, but it's really getting to the end of the fuse here. There's really not much farther we can go.
Well, guys like Peter Schiff can predict what's going to happen next, and a lot of them have been absolutely right. The hardest thing to
Right.
predict, and they'll tell you, is the timing,
Exactly.
because you don't know what the government's going to do because they do so many screwed up things. It's like you know what they should do, but what
Right.
they
And you don't
actually do is a different story.
exactly, and then you don't know on the flip side how the people are going to react to that, and then what the market's going to do next. So, I mean, you can predict and you can say it's going to happen, but the timing, like you said, is just it's really difficult. But everything these guys said so far, whether it's Robert Kiyosaki, Peter Schiff, I mean, all these guys predicted this stuff, man. They said what was going to happen, and they kind of predicted it down to a T. And
That's not a
we're
coincidence either.
no. And they say about, a lot of people say about Peter Schiff, oh, even a clock is right two times, a broken clock is right two times a day, and it's just not a fair comparison because it's those are the people that just, you know what it is, when somebody gets a piece of information that totally contradicts the way they think and their own paradigm of life, people can't like process it right,
Yeah.
and I think that's the reason why people just won't believe that we're in the situation we're in.
Yeah, it's a shame, but that's why we're trying to do our part, helping people kind of
Yeah.
see what's actually going on. Stop believing what the government tells you. They're probably the last people you should believe. And the Fed is probably the most misunderstood thing of all the significant factors of our government. Starting with the fact that the Fed is not part of the government, but it's so
Right.
important and nobody knows anything about it. So, I mean, just do your homework and read a little bit more about it for
Right.
yourself. Ron Paul's got a book, and the Fed is probably a great place to start. But just understand that they control the interest rates. The interest rates control the economy, and it just sends people to do things that they wouldn't otherwise normally do, and that's where everything gets screwed up.
Right, and an interesting thing too is a lot of the world problems kind of gravitate around the people involved in the Fed, and you can only speculate, a lot. And it's funny, they rolled out as conspiracy theories, but it's really theories of what can really be going on. It's just funny how the same people kind of tied in the same names over and over.
Yeah.
One of them being, I guess, JFK. Before he was assassinated, he was actually, a lot of people wanted him dead, and for the right reasons, because he was trying to get us out of Vietnam. He was trying to patch things up with Cuba.
Did you just say for the right reasons?
Well, a lot of the times when somebody wants somebody dead, it's for for bad reasons. They hurt somebody or they did something bad. What I'm saying is JFK was on the right track, and people wanted him dead for it.
Oh, for doing the right things.
It sounded bad, right? Yeah, how I said it didn't sound good. But basically, one of the things he did too that the Fed didn't like was he printed silver certificates, And basically, if you look at the top of your dollar, it says Federal Reserve note. On his dollars, it said silver certificate. And just like back in the day, you had gold certificates where you can go claim a piece of gold with your dollar. That was when your dollar was backed by something legitimate. He was trying to get us on a silver system, and he had like 500 billion or something enough to sustain the economy. And before he can issue it and use this new currency, he was obviously assassinated. So it's just a very and you can speculate, on what really happens and doesn't happen throughout any major event that happens in history. But just kind of one piece of advice: follow the money trail. Follow who's making money, how they're making money, and you'll get your answers. Really, I mean, that's with anything.
That's it. And just educate yourself. Read a lot on it. Don't just take our word for it. Do your own homework. And this is something you have to know about, because if you have a job, if you're in business for yourself or whatever, you need to know about interest rates and the Fed, and not in depth, but just kind of have an idea of what's going on and how messed up the whole system is.
Right. And when you start researching, you're gonna watch a lot of videos where it's gonna be like a devil voice talking about the Fed. I don't want people to do this. They make it seem like it's some demonic this, that. I mean, it may as well could be, but that turns people off, I think, sometimes, because but the thing is, you just looking at the facts is crazy enough. You don't need some crazy conspiracy behind. Just the facts of the Fed and who's involved, and what's going on with it is just crazy enough that you don't even need all this crazy nonsense. And one thing is the Rothschild family that we were talking about. If you look into them, this banking dynasty has been around for a while, and Mayor Rothschild actually said, "Give me the right to print a nation's currency, and I care not who makes his laws." And that's basically true. And they've been behind financing wars on both sides for what, over 2 centuries, maybe, for a very long time. Speculatively, because like you mentioned earlier, it's not them directly tied to it. They have interest in the bank, or they own stocks, or whatever the case is. But
yeah, and like we said at the top of the show, Federal Reserve Bank. It's not federal; it's private, and it's owned by people. You know what I mean? And it's very hard to trace it back and see who actually owns it. But the Rothschilds are certainly involved, and they're controlling our money supply. It's crazy.
Yeah, and 3 things to note is that what I found out recently, that there's 3 countries in the world that don't have Rothschild banking central bank in their country. And again, you got to do your homework to kind of trace it back to them, and it's kind of impossible. But they leave a money trail. Like there's always a money trail. But basically, it's Iran, Cuba, and North Korea. So I'm just going to go on record and say, just keep an eye out within the next year about how Cuba relations go, because you're going to see President Obama on TV trying to patch things up. And if you really read between the lines, I wouldn't be surprised if there's a reserve bank, a central bank set up in Cuba within the next year or so. And it's just so I keep an eye out for that. I'm waiting for it. It's just kind of inevitable unless something happens to stop it. But yeah. So I'm just going to go on record and say it. I might be wrong, but we'll see what happens.
So yeah, so keep an eye out. I think that about wraps it up. I mean, we kind of hit everything we wanted to touch. I know last week we were trying to get a guest on the show. That kind of fell through. We had to push it off a little bit. So hopefully next week for that. And then we have an episode on podcasting coming up too, probably 2 weeks from now. So some cool stuff coming up. So check this one out, beyondaveragepodcast.com/008. Beyondaveragepodcast.com is the website. Subscribe on iTunes and Stitcher. And Facebook.com/BeyondAveragePodcast. And listen, like the stuff, subscribe, share it, help us out, leave us a review on iTunes, and thank you in advance for that. Anything else to add, Corey?
No, just like you said, thank you. Like it, share it, comment on it, and if you want us to go more in depth in the future on Federal Reserve, I'd be more than happy to. I kind of kept it light today, but there's a lot of hidden secrets that would absolutely blow your mind. It's almost like the Twilight Zone. It really is, and it's. But if you look at human history, if you look at the history of just the world in general, it's just really not hard to believe some of the stuff that goes on. But yeah, like I said, like it, share it, give us a review, and let us know, what you think, because we're gonna keep putting them out no matter what you think. But we like to know. but we like to know, kind of what everybody thinks about it. So,
You give us some
thank you again.
feedback. So, all right, that about wraps it up. So we're out of here. We'll see you guys next week.
All right. Good night.